This panel is this is the antitrust panel, the future of antitrust in the digital marketplace. And obviously, as we all know, the focus of antitrust on major technology companies is not a new thing. We have the IBM case, AT&T and Microsoft, most of which predated the internet. But the focus now is of antitrust, and this is really in a global context, is on basically on most of the successful internet companies: Google, Amazon, Apple, Facebook. So it kind of seems like having to deal with major antitrust investigations is the price of being successful. We're gonna follow the same model that we did in the earlier panels. I've asked each of the panelists to very briefly, and hopefully no more than 2 minutes, make a major point or two, and then we'll get into the discussion. We're going to go in reverse alphabetical order this time.
Be still my heart.
You must always do.
Larry's not used to this. He needs a little time to adjust to it. I don't know. And you have the bios, but Larry White is a professor at the NYU Stern School of Business and a former chief economist of the Antitrust Division at the Justice Department. Larry?
All right, I'm going to make a few points. First, I would urge all of you to download a copy of the Antitrust Guidelines for the Licensing of Intellectual Property, which the U.S. Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission put out on August 12. I think it's a very interesting document and presents the mindset of the way DOJ and FTC think about tech issues, IP issues. Second, I would remind you, antitrust is not about size. It's about actions that may unduly exacerbate or enhance market power. That's important. It's about, and it's not even about market power, it's about actions that will unduly enhance whether it's a merger, whether it's some kind of marketplace action, some kind of agreement, some kind of tying, some kind of preference that would unduly enhance or exacerbate market power. Third, there is an unavoidable dilemma of antitrust with respect to things like tech, where if you act too soon, you risk choking off of promising technologies, promising paths. If you act too late, the powers of incumbency, the network effects, the reinforcing, the path dependency may be so strong that you've cemented market power, and entry is very difficult. And related to that, yes, there have been instances of people in garages coming up with disrupting technologies, but that's not a good basis for antitrust. Relying on there are going to be people in garages coming up with disrupting technologies is not a good basis for antitrust policy. And then finally, I would urge you to remember the sort of general approach that industrial organization has had toward thinking about innovation over the last 25, 30 years is that there are a number of influences on innovation. First, there's just the issue of technological opportunity. Which technologies seem to be ripe for innovation? Go back 200 years, it was textiles. Go back 150 years, it was steam power. It was metallurgy. It was railroads. Go back 100 years, and it was electricity and the internal combustion engine. Go back 50 years, mainframe computers, telecoms, and they, of course, were intimately related with each other. 25 years ago, that's, digitization. So technological opportunity, we no longer think about textiles so much as although I'm sure there's lots of good innovation still happening in textiles. Appropriability is another important influence, like the strength of IP protection, and as we now know, it may be that it can be too strong, but for sure it can be too weak. Third, the general conditions of market demand, expanding demand, generally more favorable towards innovation. Enterprise size is going to be an influence, and that will be industry dependent. Some industries, smaller enterprises can come up with important innovations. On the other hand, if we were talking about nuclear power, nuclear generation, I don't think we're going to be seeing small enterprises come up with important innovations there. And finally, market power. Both the enterprise size and market power issues go back to Joseph Schumpeter, thinking about these issues in the 1940s. He didn't talk about it in these ways, but the issue of market power really is as a making up for inadequate appropriability protections. That if you couldn't protect an innovation through appropriate intellectual property, then market power was a way for making up for that. So I urge you, think about all these things. They are difficult. This is really hard stuff. But of course, as Michael on this panel knows, that's why we pay our government servants such handsome salaries.
Thank you, Larry. Our next speaker is Jeff Manny, who's the executive director of the International Center for Law and Economics and a longtime writer on antitrust and competition issues. Jeff?
Thanks, Tom. So what I have to say follows nicely from what you said, Larry. In particular, I want to talk about the ways that high-tech industries tend to be somewhat different from more traditional industries, and what that says about the use of traditional antitrust tools to assess competition in more high-tech industries. A lot of this goes back to writing that Jordy and Teese did in the 1980s, and in particular where they highlighted that in high-tech industries, traditional price-based antitrust tools don't work all that well for understanding markets, where for these industries it's performance, not price, that tends to be paramount, which means, as Larry suggested, innovation is really key. But it also means that the course or the dynamics of these markets look very different. These industries are often marked by disruptions or paradigm shifts rather than the traditional kind of contest for horizontal market share. And it also means that innovation and investment are important signals of competition and shouldn't be disregarded as indications that there is in fact competition, even if there isn't a large number of competitors. This comes from the continual threat of new entry down the road. And this may be new entry way down the road that requires innovation and investment today, the anticipation of competition, even if it hasn't materialized yet. So a big concern, as Larry also suggested, might be conduct that seems to impede new entry, and that's appropriate, but it is really important to remember that innovation comes from within these incumbent firms as well, and that oftentimes I think the traditional approaches tend to overweight the foreclosure of new entry effects of business conduct and underweight these innovation effects. And part of that is a function of, I think we'll talk about later, a function of how we define markets here. So there's a lot of vertical integration in these markets, and now we start to talk about these sort of platform markets in particular that I think a lot of us in this room are concerned about. Foreclosure of either competition or some inchoate idea of conduct by users of the platforms becomes really important, because essentially all of these platforms are not only providing a platform, but they're also competing on the platform, and there's this I think overemphasis on something like self-dealing, somewhat rooted in the idea that a lot of these platforms ought to be treated as if they are essential facilities. It's not a coincidence that terms typically applied to common carriers like neutrality get applied to some of these platforms as in search neutrality. I think it's exactly the wrong approach, something we need to be very careful of, and understand in particular that in order to have a platform that is innovative and successful enough to facilitate the use of the platform by additionally innovative, but typically smaller and somewhat dependent businesses, the owner of the platform has to actually manage the platform. And a lot of that form of management of the platform under kind of traditional lights looks bad. So Uber is accused of price fixing among drivers. Apple imposes an MFN and it's accused of price fixing when what it's probably really doing is trying to ensure that it has critical mass to make it worth entering a new market. Google tweaks its algorithm, imposes quality scores. It obviously affects certain sites. And the harmed sites complain, but of course Google thinks what it's doing is helping users, not harming these sites in particular. I'll have lots more to say on this, but I'll just close by saying I think the implication of all of this and more is per se approaches and ex-ante regulations, things like the platform regulation in Europe are likely to be very problematic. And also, we need to take a much more expansive view of efficiencies, including considering entry as an efficiency, taking a longer time horizon for assessing the likelihood of new entry, and most importantly, recognizing out-of-market efficiencies, which I think is something else I hope we'll all talk about is a real problem for the application of traditional antitrust in both the US and the EU to these high-tech markets.
Thanks, Jeff. Our next speaker is Bill Kovacic. Bill is a former chairman of and commissioner at and general counsel at the FTC. Bill?
Thank you, Tom, for having me here. I think that the stage is being set for a notable expansion of antitrust intervention in the affairs of tech companies. First, expectations for expanded enforcement are being set by a number of key political figures, including Secretary Clinton herself. I assume that she will become the head of state, but just to give you a snapshot of how those expectations are being set. In October of last year, she issued a short statement saying that large corporations are concentrating control over markets. They are using their power to raise prices. They are limiting choices for consumers. They're imposing lower wages for workers, and they're holding back competition from startups and small businesses. Quote, "It's no wonder Americans feel that the deck is stacked against them." Elizabeth Warren earlier this year says today in America, competition is dying. Consolidation and concentration are on the rise in sector after sector. Concentration threatens our markets, threatens our economy, and threatens our democracy. And she singles out 3 firms worthy of closer scrutiny: Google, Amazon, and Apple. The CEA in April issues a short statement in which they suggest concentration has gotten to extremes that are damaging to the economy. Implication: much tougher merger control is needed to constrain this march of concentration, and certainly greater scrutiny of dominant firm behavior is appropriate. I think those expectations will be hard to resist in the future. Second, this encourages efforts abroad to impose closer scrutiny on these and other high-tech companies. As European officials listen to these kinds of comments, 2 things occurred to them. First, in their views, these people are saying right on. That is, they're speaking truth to power, and especially Senator Warren is expressing the view that needed to be expressed, one that they share, one that ought to be embraced. This is encouragement in their eyes to do the things that American enforcers won't do, like walk away from Google, instead to jump in and double the bets on cases of that kind. And they are further emboldened in this by hearing the President of the United States give an interview in which he said their antitrust enforcement efforts are mere protectionism. Footnote, to answer the question posed on the last panel, if you want a better relationship with Europe, don't have the President of the United States give that interview and say that your policymaking efforts are mere protectionism to protect your weaker firms in front of our great American companies. So, Foreign competition officials look at this as encouragement to do the job that the United States doesn't have the fortitude to do. And by the way, they listen carefully for the rebuttal from the antitrust community. And in their ears, it is remarkable that there has not been the full-throated defense of the competition policy program that is being attacked in statements of this kind. So, more to come from Europe, encouraged by what they see to be an acknowledgement by key American officials that the US enforcement program has not done its job. Last, the courts are changing in a way that would make a more expansive enforcement program in the US attractive. You have seen how in court after court, the balance of views, philosophy is changing. Each president gets about 20 to 25% of the appointees. That's going to continue to happen. And you're going to be swapping out more and more judges who tended to be regulation skeptics with judges who are going to have not an unlimited taste for intervention, but certainly a greater willingness to tolerate and accept intervention when it is proposed by the public enforcement agencies. Notice how in the FTC's investigation of Google, the FTC backed away in many ways because Google said, how are you going to do in a gauntlet that will include the DC Circuit and then the Supreme Court? I'm not so sure that is such an intimidating threat today. And as you look ahead 2, 3, 4 years, the odds of bringing that kind of case and doing it successfully tend to increase. The courts are a great prize in the election ahead. My sense is they tend to tip increasingly in the direction of a greater taste for intervention.
So let me ask a little follow-up question, if I could. So I think you're obviously concerned about what might happen in the future in the U.S. Am I correct in assuming that implicit in what you're saying, that the policies up to the present, the enforcement policies in the U.S. at least, have been pretty good?
I certainly don't see them as being too timid. And the suggestion is, in area after area, Secretary Clinton in 2015 said, for example, in the pharma sector, branded pharmaceutical producers without any legal concern at all can form agreements with generics. That's a direct attack on what has been one of the most successful bipartisan programs going back a 15-year period. I mean, if these things aren't good enough, if merger control as we've had it is not good enough, if scrutiny of dominant firms is not good enough, what's going to suffice in the future? So I think enforcement has been suitably aggressive to this point. All of these statements tend to say it's been deficient. This is in many ways an attack on what we have.
Right. And our last speaker is Michael Katz, who's a professor at Berkeley and also a former chief economist at the Antitrust Division. Michael.
I have to say I'm tempted to just cede all of my time to Bill because it's way more entertaining than what I have to say. Let me add the one thing to your concern about the increased enforcement and sort of moving more to a regulatory stance and antitrust policy. I think in that regard, Silicon Valley has been pretty short-sighted because, at least from my perspective, if you look what goes on at the FCC, which has, I think, to some of us seems like it's pursuing a very Silicon Valley-centric agenda, it's extremely regulatory and I think very much against antitrust principles. And in fact, one of the justifications for it, and take net neutrality, is the argument that, oh, well, American antitrust isn't up to it. It can't provide the protection that's necessary. Therefore, we need prophylactic regulation in the form of net neutrality. I think we see the same thing in the business data services proceeding as well, where again, it's Silicon Valley firms largely that are driving the call for greater regulation. And as I say, I think it's short-sighted. We've already seen this a little bit with, certainly in the past, Google was an advocate of net neutrality, and now you hear people saying that you should have search neutrality, and I have to say I think they're both bad ideas. So anyway, I do think that that's part of it, is that industries see the strategic use of antitrust and regulation as benefiting them, and they sort of get focused on that, and I think lose sometimes sense of the bigger picture. On the future of antitrust in the digital marketplace, I think the future is largely the same as the past. I think one thing, actually panels like this always make me nervous, is antitrust is, or at least should be, extremely fact-specific. And I hope that remains the case in the future. So done right, you really do have to look at every case separately, and it is extremely hard to make good generalizations. Let me just throw out a couple other things. unfortunately for me, this panel is too intelligent to have said a lot of the things I usually like to attack, but I'll pretend I did. But if you look at what's happening, if you look at, well, what difference does it make that's the internet? We sort of went through this phase where people said, well, because of network effects, there are these big economies of scale, there's being winner take most or winner take all and dominance, and people started seeing network effects everywhere and said, everywhere we look, there's harm to competition, and we really need to have antitrust intervention. Then we sort of went into another phase where we said, well, no, really, if you look, those are two-sided markets. There are network effects on both sides, and there's harm from intervention everywhere because it's really too complicated to understand, and it needs an all-new antitrust, and we don't have it. As you can imagine, I think both of those views are way too extreme. There clearly are issues of network effects, and lots of markets are two-sided. But I think, again, a carefully done fact-specific inquiry can deal with both of those things. One of the things which actually has been alluded to a bit in this conference, though, is also this notion of internet time and everything just moves too quickly for antitrust, which I have to say I think is largely a bunch of nonsense. Notably, actually, the person on my right did not say this at the time of US v. Microsoft, but it was quite common to say, look, this is hopeless. This industry moves so swiftly. Sure, Microsoft dominates desktops today, but by the time you're done with this case, it won't. When the DC Circuit had its decision in 2001, that was 15 years ago. It's just in the last couple of months that Microsoft's desktop market share fell below 90%. So the notion that somehow things are moving so rapidly, I think, is just wrong. Now, at the same time, if you look at Microsoft, right, I think it also turns out, though, that the theory of the case in the end, was wrong, right? Remember the whole thing, when the government finally finished amending its complaint, was that browsers were going to be this path to supplant the operating system, that they were going to make it a commodity, and it would be this migration path away. And as we've seen, that turned out not to be the case. There are, in fact, extremely successful browsers, and yet those have not eroded Microsoft's desktop share at all. Now, a bunch of you are thinking, wait, this just shows how old this guy is, or out of it, because we really know the big thing is mobile OS. And it is in a lot of ways. Now, there are clearly places where it's not a substitute for desktop. But I think that really brings us to, in some sense, it says at a very high level the Microsoft case was right, but they sort of missed what the particular avenue would be. And this whole notion of disruptors, I think, is important. And I will say this with a little bit of trepidation, because I think there'll be a set of people who jump into it and try and take policy way too far. But I think this whole thing about companies coming in, being disruptors, and this competition for the market, not competition within it, really does raise some pretty tricky problems for antitrust. I mean, again, that's what the Microsoft case was about. It was about saying, look, these guys could otherwise have come in, taken over the whole market. And I think it's something that's a really difficult issue for merger policy. And other people have raised this, is if you have a company that's coming in and right now does not look like the companies it's eventually going to displace, traditional antitrust on a merger would say, look, they're in separate markets, or this new company has a really tiny market share. What's the big deal? But if that's the path to displacing the incumbent, there are reasons we might want to really be worried about mergers where the incumbents are buying up everyone as a potential disruptor. Now, I said that with some trepidation because it is with good reason that bringing cases based on potential entry arguments are very difficult to bring, and we've got to be careful that we sort of don't see problems everywhere, that we don't stop what could otherwise have been very useful combinations of complements. But I do think it's something that needs more thought, and at that I'll stop.
Well, let's take off a little bit. I think it's not exactly the direction Bill was going, but it was alluded to by Bill. I mean, it seems to me that at the present time, much, if not most, of the action in antitrust is, especially as regards high-tech companies, is not in the United States, but is in Europe and maybe elsewhere, and which has a much more aggressive, up to now, aggressive enforcement policy than the U.S. We can get into some of the specifics, but anybody have some general comments on that, or?
No, I think that's right. Certainly for single firm behavior. Brussels
Right.
is the headquarter globally of public enforcement involving single firm conduct. And that's likely to continue into the future. It is shaped by several things. One is, and Mike alluded to this before, It's the somewhat short-sighted view, arguably, of the US tech community, that is, who's in there providing ammunition day after day for the development of cases? US companies, first and foremost. Not alone, but first and foremost. By the way, it's a strategy they're replicating in Beijing today. That is, where do you show up? Throw sand in the gears of your rival? It's Beijing as well. So if you have US companies coming to the Europeans, and they're often saying, we're here because your people will not do their job. Are the Europeans to say, well, we simply ignore you? The second foreshaping this is their own view that they have a better program, that the US indeed has defaulted in key areas here, and that the pressure that they're receiving is an acknowledgement, in a sense, by the United States that it can't do the job well. So I think Europe is likely to sustain that position. A final thought is they're proud of it. That is, this is a sense, this creates a sense of significance and importance. It's the most important ingredient of policymaking in the European Union. It's the most important directorate, so that there's a sense that, yes, we are now the leading institution, and we are glad to have that status. That's not going to change. And to the extent that it is Europe, Europe is the most influential system globally, so that the principles and practices that are accepted in Europe are seen as validation by other jurisdictions, China, Korea, India, others, for taking a similar path. And it's no accident that they have opened up their own files dealing with many of the same enterprises.
So let's not let the U.S. off the hook entirely, though. I think you said this in your remarks, in particular, or sorry, actually it was Mike, who pointed to the FCC as a source of an entity that is engaging in what a lot of us would consider, and they claim, right, the mantra is competition, competition, competition. They're doing antitrust sort of work under a very different guise and in a way that is, I would argue, sort of systematically disregarding most of the learning about antitrust that we know. I'd say, among other things, they're kind of fighting a long war on vertical integration without any understanding of the actual seeming understanding of the benefits of vertical integration. So I think there has been perhaps somewhat of a shift if you're trying to find government agencies that are doing a bad job here. Yes, look to Europe, but also look to the FCC, and then don't forget that and you did note this, that merger enforcement is still pretty rampant here, and I think there've been a lot of missteps there and a lot of politicization of that recently. And then I just want to draw attention, among other things, to the Apple ebooks case, which I think has a lot of problems and demonstrates a lot of the things that I mentioned, a lot of the ways in which there are difficulties applying some of the very traditional antitrust approaches to these more high-tech markets, and that's happening in the U.S. as well, of course.
Let me just add that there's a 40-year-old, 50-year-old cliche in American antitrust approach, which I think de facto is different in Europe, that American antitrust is aimed at protecting competition, not protecting competitors. And the Europeans will give lip service to that idea, but they seem to be more sympathetic to if you've got competitors coming around who's saying we've been disadvantaged by thus and such, that proposed merger, this vertical arrangement, or this vertical merger, whatever. The Europeans seem to be more sympathetic to that without going deeper and asking, well, what are the consequences for competition? That's really what ought to be explored.
Larry, if I could add one wrinkle to that, I think in their view, there is a lack of confidence that you would find in North America. You do not have the confidence that if a firm disappears that you're going to have an organic process where new firms emerge to contest the position of the incumbents. That's an acknowledgement, I think, of the stickiness of capital markets, the regulatory regime. So the disappearance of an individual firm to them has more significance for that reason. But that should force you in the direction of asking, why aren't those initial conditions better?
Well, there's also another difference, though, and that's the right to private action. Right? And in the U.S., I mean, certainly was it true when I was at DOJ, one of the things you rely on as a safety valve is a firm would come in and complain. And you say, fine, if you think you can prevail in court, bring a case. And so that's another way, you were talking about entry as something as a backstop, but there's also in the U.S. private action as a backstop.
And a lot of the U.S. jurisprudence has been shaped by awareness that private rights, our style, over-deters. And it will be interesting to see with the greater EU emphasis on private rights of action over the years, along growth, do we see a similar adjustment in doctrine to account for this?
One of the things that's been, sticking with Europe now, one of the things that has been has an increased amount of talk, and I guess more than talk in Europe, is this whole question, which obviously affects virtually all of the successful internet companies, that the accumulation of large amounts of data is an antitrust problem. Kind of data, sometimes referred to as data as a barrier to entry. There's apparently a new Franco-German study which basically says, asks the question, I guess they don't come to that many conclusions, is whether if a firm is capable of sustaining a data set that is unmatched by rivals, that is an antitrust problem. I mean, there's a whole bunch of questions that this opens up. One is the kind of the protectionist question that we're talking about, since these companies are virtually all American companies. But there's also all sorts of there's also some market definition questions and a lot of questions, and I think they're just starting to bring cases. I don't know if there are any major cases that are being brought on this basis, but it's obviously in the wind.
Could I actually say one thing when you were saying the extent you're doing this is European protectionism? As far as I know, the biggest proponent of the data as a barrier to entry theory is Microsoft. And Microsoft is, last they checked, is an American company. Maybe you could debate that. I don't know where they pay their taxes, but okay.
Relatively not a data-rich company.
But again, I mean, this comes back to Bill's point. It's American companies a lot of times in Europe saying we want this stuff.
Right. I understand. Yeah.
Which, I mean, it's not to say what they're doing is not bad stuff in the end, talking about the government decisions, but the motive may be very different than people think. Well, look, I think this, though, comes back, and I have to disclose, I worked for Google on this, but it's an example where it's very fact-specific, and if Google has what they will say is evidence, and I, looking at it, thought they were right, that says it's actually, Bing's problems are not a lack of data, that Google is much smarter about what they do. Now, you could start saying, you know what, really smart people's an essential facility, and maybe Google should be forced to share that, and there's some evidence that Microsoft believes that because they started just copying Google's search results. Right. But I mean, really, I think a lot of this comes down to what you think of a data as a barrier to entry. There are two things. One, if you think that is a problem, are you just recognizing that as any other entry barrier, a background condition you take into account, assessing market power?
Brand equity.
It's
so unfair that
right.
these guys have famous brands.
And this is where they're taking it the farther, is they're basically trying to declare data to be an essential facility. And that's a huge difference, right, between the U.S. and Europe. And I think the U.S. is on the right side of things.
But so that in particular is you're absolutely right, of course. But it's very hard to sustain that in the face of any kind of rational thought, economic logic, anything like that. In particular, this does go, as Tom suggested, this goes in part to the market definition problem. When for some reason, when some actors or enforcers look at, say, Google's data, they could only come to the essential facilities conclusion if they believe that only that data is capable of doing what Google is doing, and what Google is doing is offering search results. But it's actually much more complicated than that. There are actually numerous sources of data data in online advertising markets, which by the way is of course broader than just search, but nevertheless Amazon, Facebook, and others are excluded from Google's market because the mechanism they use for matching users and advertisers is different. That I don't think that's actually sustainable, but especially when you're talking about the data, it's just an artificial distinction. But remember that the data is only useful because it's a proxy for characteristics about the underlying people, their preferences in particular. But of course, if you start to see it that way, you recognize that there are numerous ways of obtaining that information about those people. There are numerous types of data that could be helpful in, for example, matching users with advertisers online. And the idea that one company sort of has a monopoly on data, which is non-rivalrous and all of that, is just ridiculously far-fetched, I think. Which isn't to say it couldn't be a problem in certain contexts where a certain type of data really is essential to participating in a certain market. I don't think any of these kind of digital economy platform cases fit that bill.
Tom, could I just add another interpretation of what you see behind the concern with big data? It goes back to our earlier two panels today. I think in the backdrop, there exists a powerful concern on privacy and consumer protection grounds about the behavior of these firms. And there's enormous pressure, I believe, inside the European Commission, inside the national competition authorities and their relationship with data protection authorities. There's enormous concern to give effect to policy impulses that seek to impose greater controls on how data sets are collected, how they're maintained, how they're transferred. So that what you see emerging, I think, in some ways, perhaps even unconsciously, in the debate over competition law is a fundamental underlying concern about privacy and data protection, with competition law, perhaps in the German Facebook case more explicitly, but certainly implicitly being used as a device to try and solve this problem.
Do you think legitimately so? So I mean, in particular, with respect to privacy as an antitrust relevant product characteristic, which has been thrown around, but also.
I think in the way that Ginger was describing before, that is, if there's a rigorous effort to identify qualitative variables with respect to the competition among different firms, and you look at the effect of a merger on those qualitative variables, it's entirely legitimate. I think that's an appropriate question to ask. What concerns me a lot is where competition law is being used, in effect, to give power to a collateral regulatory regime, and especially for merger review. Notice why merger review is so important. They have to come to you and stand in the queue. You have regulatory leverage. They can go on the fast track, they can go on the slow track. And where they're deciding whether to go on the fast track or the slow track, the competition agency is in a position to say, by the way, while you're here, I've got a list. Here's other stuff I want. Will you give it to me as a condition for going on the fast track? That's a path towards oblivion.
By the way, something the FCC absolutely specializes in.
Yeah.
So you think
anyone.
that if they start bringing cases like this, the remedies will be, rather than competition-oriented, will be privacy-oriented?
Oh, and there'll be settlements. There'll either be settlements in merger review, or there'll be settlements in abuse cases where concessions are made, and you can dress them up as competition matters with a little bit of cleverness in drafting the settlement. But you'll see, and again, this is a concern about where it goes, is the use of competition-based mechanisms, procedural and substantive, to extract concessions related to a collateral regulatory regime. And by the way, there are a lot of other jurisdictions in the world that would love to do that. And when they see the adults do it, they think, I'm in.
And by the way, if you haven't read Kovacic and Hyman's work on this, it's fantastic.
Regulatory leverage.
Should be read.
Right. I mean, so you don't, I mean, because you would think, maybe it seems a little far-fetched from a, it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, but you would think that the competition-based approach would be some sort of open access to the data set that maybe a company like Google has, which I would seem to me to be, again, the path to oblivion. But which is not particularly necessarily a privacy-related remedy. But you don't see them going that way. You see them just trying to extract other concerns.
I don't think it's been manifest in a specific enforcement matter with a specific result, but I'm struck at how much discussion there is around the idea that Mike referred to before, that in some sense data is an essential facility. And because it's so hard to construct a certain data set, data pool,
right,
that access must be provided. And the European regime is more sympathetic to using essential facility notions to compel
right,
the right to access.
I do feel compelled to point out, though, that there's a way, there has to be a ways to go before we can ever possibly get there, even in Europe. And my primary data point for this is that the European Commission in the Facebook WhatsApp case identified Facebook as being, its share of data across the web amounted to about 6 or 7%. And to go from that to saying that any one of these companies, let's assume Facebook has as much data as anyone, could amount to an essential facility. I mean, it's going to be a while before they can get there if they treat that as precedent in subsequent cases. But that was a merger case, and there was a very specific theory of harm there. There may be lots of ways to back away from them.
And I think, Jeff, you see, and within DG Comp and in public statements, there's a wariness about being drawn into basically being the enforcement mechanism for data protection law, and that if you do that, they realize, where does this stop? What other policies would not be implicated?
Not to give people bad ideas, but it does seem like there's a way somebody could try to tie them in. But rather than going the route of sharing the information, which, as you say, could make privacy worse, though, is you could imagine Europe saying, well, okay, your data gives you an unfair advantage when you use the data certain ways, and therefore, rather than make you share it, we just will make you not even use it yourself or restrict how you can use it. And so it seems like that could be a dangerous avenue for saying, in the name of competition and privacy together, doing something that's probably very anti-competitive in the end.
And what about the notion that actually data, I mean, this doesn't necessarily apply to a particular company, but the ubiquity of data and data sources is really pro-competitive. It makes it easier for new companies to enter various markets. And I mean, would that get damaged by a competition policy of the type that we're talking about? I mean, new companies can, there's all sorts of sources for data that you need. You can get, lists of customers to start with and enter more easily.
Well, I certainly think that the underlying point of what you just said, that there is, we have to be careful to generalize. I mean, I think most of us up here have been expressing skepticism, so I'm going to put it this way. I'll speak hyperbolically, but just assume that I'm being hyperbolic. But there is a strong discounting of pro-competitive benefits of things like network effects, like scale economies, like data. You point to them, you can say that's a barrier to entry, and that becomes sort of the end of the analysis rather than the beginning of the analysis. I think there's a risk of that in any particular case. I don't know, to your specific question, whether it necessarily implicates what happens in other cases. But this is why I'd like to see doctrinally, let me just focus on the one thing in particular, and maybe some of us can discuss. In both the US and in Europe, there is most prevalently in merger cases, but in other cases as well, this resistance to recognizing out-of-market efficiencies. And so, not to go too far into treating multi-sided platforms as special, as Mike pointed out, but there is some real relevance here where you have two sides or three or more sides of a platform, and you have some conduct undertaken on one side that may have identifiable harms on that side, but countervailing even larger benefits to someone else somewhere else on the platform. I think just, sort of, at least at that very simple level, we can see that we ought to take account of those benefits before we condemn the harms on the other side. But I think it extends more broadly than simply the multi-sided platforms. But I think there is a real resistance to that. There's actually, a doctrinal impediment. There's court cases that are impediments to this, and not to say this is necessarily the most important problem, but it's a pretty important one, I think, in these sort of high-tech industries. I'd love to hear others.
Let me jump in here and maybe introduce the first piece of discord on the platform here.
We need some discourse.
I've always, and this goes back 35 years or so when I was the chief economist for Bill Baxter, skeptical of promises of efficiencies. Efficiencies are easy to promise. Sometimes they may be difficult to achieve, but the egg has been scrambled, the merger has happened. Sometimes it can be undone, but often not. And so I've been encouraged by the gradual sort of thinking hard about the issue of efficiencies, that they're more credible when they've been uncovered in the normal course of business documents rather than ginned up by a consulting firm the day after the announcement of the merger. These sorts of skepticism, but show me that in the normal course of business there were these arguments for greater efficiencies, not at the time of the merger. But you got to be careful. You've got to be skeptical about efficiencies claims at times of mergers.
But not the claims of anti-competitive effect. So there is one of the big problems is the disparity of treatment of efficiencies, and so it takes more to demonstrate an efficiency, but the agency can without any direct evidence demonstrate at least for burden shifting purposes likely anti-competitive effect. Isn't that also something that should be treated with the same skepticism?
I found it more, what can I say? I found it more convincing.
And I'd say,
you're not the only one.
I'd say, Larry, even if you have the pre-existing ordinary course documents that give some plausibility to the story, as an enforcement agency, you're still in the position, in the sense of taking a bit of a chance, a calculated risk that they're going to be manifest in the way that they've been set out. And the arguments tend to be pressed most strongly when it's, say, 3-2, or even 2-1, and that's a real tough call to make.
Let me open it up to Hal. Oh, yeah.
So I want to say a word or two about GAFAM. I don't know if Americans will recognize the acronym, but every European does. It's Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft. Appears daily in the newspapers. What's remarkable about GAFAM is how intensely they compete against each other. So they're competing in operating systems, and storage, and cloud, and calendars, and email, and streaming video, audio, books, soon-to-be virtual reality, digital assistants, on and on and on. I mean, it is the most intensive sector of the economy, intensively competitive sector of the economy. That's why the prices are so low, usually zero in many cases, and that's why the innovation is so high. So what is the message that's coming from the Europeans about GAFAM? Well, Google, just stick to general purpose search and you'll be okay. Microsoft, just stick to the operating system and desktop. Amazon, just sell books. Get away from all these fancy things about competing in other areas. Facebook, Apple, I mean, they're virtually saying, divide up the market into these segments, just compete there, don't try to disrupt or compete against each other in some other dimension, and everything will be great. Pretty perverse from the U.S. point of view.
Well, does this also get to the question of market definition, that a lot of times these firms are not considered in the same market when in fact they are competing against each other? Yeah.
I just want to make a comment about sort of how we look at data in antitrust analysis. I think data could be an input, could be a product itself. It could also be an asset for the company. And in our casework, we do differentiate those. For example, in 2008, I think we have a case for the merger between Reed Elsevier and Choice Point, where we not only identify that both of them would have a database including electronic public record for law enforcement customers. We also look at sort of both firms develop algorithm using that database and the algorithm is very important for the kind of services in the market that they compete with. So we end up sort of requesting a divestiture of choice point of their electronic database on the basis that not only they compete on the data itself, but more importantly, the analytics they offer, the algorithm, the sophisticated algorithm they offer from that data. I think that's the important difference we should make between data just as a product itself versus sort of data just an input for the final product. And the barrier to entry could occur in both stages and should be analyzed both.
Well, I just would echo that in particular. It's great if the FTC is being careful about this, and that doesn't mean that everyone is always going to be careful about it. And certainly in the sort of public policy discussions, I think data is frequently mistaken for the processing of data. Right? Hal makes this point frequently when Microsoft or someone else says, we can't possibly compete in your market because we don't have anything like the amount of data you have. On the other hand, they also don't have the algorithm, the processing power, or anything else that Google has. And I can't imagine a world in which we would want Google to have to share that with new entrants, even if you, not that I can, but even if you could imagine a world in which that might be true of data. And yet, I think a lot of people sense a real risk that it will be assumed that the advantage comes from the volume of data, not the ability to process it. And I don't have confidence in every agency or court recognizing the important distinction.
Yeah, I have confidence in the approach that Ginger laid out, and I think there's a commitment internally at the Commission to do this. There are temptations to stray. In Google AdMob, the Bureau of Consumer Protection put on a full court press to put purely privacy specifications in the second request. That was defeated, but there was a determination by that side of the House to use this wonderful merger review mechanism to just do a little looking. And maybe as part of the discussion to say, Google, while you're here, we can let this go through, but are you willing to help us by putting a couple of things into the settlement that steers you in the direction of greater privacy protection? That was resisted wisely. I think just a further reflection on Hal's point, a couple of, I think there is resistance, certainly as you say, to seeing on the part of many enforcement officials, and certainly in the Brussels Regulatory community, watching this interaction as hand-to-hand combat over what the future of information services and product delivery would be, with each of them trying to make sure that somebody else does not get the jump on them in achieving the kind of success that they, in fact, have achieved in a way that couldn't have been imagined before. And seeing competition in that way is not comfortable. I'm afraid in many ways the companies themselves do not help themselves in the way in which they approach DG Comp in different matters. They're coming into DG Comp and taking exactly a more narrow, niche, watertight compartment view of the world and saying it's not so. And the other, to go back to Mike's point about non-discrimination. If you establish the idea of non-discrimination in one policy domain for one purpose, that idea doesn't go away. Once you've invited it into the neighborhood, it remains. And I think in a number of areas, the tech community is giving different messages to the regulators, and it's no surprise that they pick a couple of narratives they like and say, this is the one we're going to take.
Strongly second that.
Bob?
Bob Crandall again, TPI Brookings. If Bill's right and we're going to see a new regime bringing more abusive dominance cases in the United States, given past history of these cases, I would assume Michael would agree that whatever your view on the Microsoft case was, the relief was not very effective. Would it be better, rather than looking for imposing structural or behavioral relief, to take a European approach and impose very large fines as deterrence against future bad behavior?
I'm on record. My approach to the Microsoft case was I did think they violated the antitrust laws. I did think they went out of their way to make life difficult for Netscape because they feared that Netscape plus Java was going to be an alternative platform that would challenge Windows. But I couldn't think of a good remedy, and so I would have been happy with a large fine for Microsoft in the late 1990s. Something low 11 digits would have hurt, would have stung, but wouldn't have put them out of business, would have sent a clear message. This was unacceptable behavior. Don't do it again. And those of you who are in similar situations where you might be tempted to go out of your way to make life difficult for prospective entrants, whatever, in an area that is otherwise difficult to enter, be careful. You could face a similar type of penalty. So I'm very sympathetic to that.
I think, Bob, you've written so much and so informatively about the problematic history of single firm behavior remedies and relief. And I think if you give truth serum to individual enforcement officials, that's still a nagging doubt about how it worked. Interesting empirical question. What was the effect of the Microsoft case? Was the remedy a form of caution to Microsoft that gave others encouragement to do things that they wouldn't have done otherwise? Were the conduct controls in ways not visible to the naked eye in some ways helpful in encouraging entry and expansion? These things are very hard to measure, and again, as you've documented, Bob, it's hard to know, but I suppose one sort of timid academic's answer is, wouldn't we like to study that in a bit more detail to have a more confident basis for making that kind of judgment? But I wonder whether as you and Larry have suggested, whether climbing the staircase of fines is something you have to add to the mix. Even there, though, I wonder how much of a deterrent it is. Intel, where there's a decision still pending in Europe, received a lot of attention because the fine there was a big round number. But my sense is that if you accept the theory of intervention there, and as it was posed in the US that Intel faced, and I'm taking their stylized view of the world, a desperate threat to their basic business model where AMD might have been able to simply flip market shares dramatically and march in with a much better product and seize the custom of OEMs and others. If you accept that and you ask, were the damages Intel paid in the US to private parties, was the fine paid to the Europeans worth it? Every dime.
Hal?
I have another comment on this data as a barrier to entry theme. Remember this morning I talked about interest-based advertising. So the idea is that you got an idea of what the interest somebody was, you could show ads based on the interest. Now if you go look at that for yourself, you'll see that it turns over very, very quickly. And the reason is advertisers don't really care if you're interested in soccer in general. They're interested in if you want to buy soccer equipment now, okay? They want to know, are you in market? So in fact, if you get a new entry that's going out there and getting a handle on your interest, they'll know all of your relevant interests in terms of purchase decisions that are in the now or in the near future within a week or two. Because that's exactly what that timetable for the interest-based advertising is. It rotates over, rotates over, rotates over.
Let me ask just one final question, and we can go to lunch. Also about the Europeans, they seem to be bringing cases on countries that go to different countries to get preferential tax treatment. Is that an appropriate use of antitrust, or is that seems to be a non?
The Europeans, DG Comp just has part of their antitrust perspective,
What's a quirk
state
of the
subsidies,
statute,
dealing with state subsidies as a competition issue. I've sort of felt comfortable in the U.S. staying away from those sorts of things. That's a legislative issue, not an antitrust enforcement issue.
Oh, but they have a specific mandate on this. I mean, they have a mandate to control state aid, to prevent subsidy schemes broadly defined from interfering with competition within the common market. So with respect to the general conceptual basis for asking about tax breaks as state aid, that's right in the center of what they do. How you apply it and interpret it in looking at individual tax schemes and competition across the member states with respect to tax rates is a very ticklish subject to them. But in generally, it's a subsidy scheme, and they have a mandate that the U.S. authorities simply don't have.
And I think there are aspects of it that are so Bill's absolutely right. It is a mandate that so it's appropriate for them to do it. I think that we should be very concerned that they'll do it right, because for a number of reasons. I think trying to understand the implications or the competitive consequences of at least the kind of tax favoritism or the letters that the advance letters they're getting, which aren't even right. Those aren't even commitments to particular treatment, I think, or the treatment actually hasn't happened yet. They're just indications that that's how they may do it. I think it no doubt is extremely hard to actually determine what the anti-competitive effects are and how they play out. So they may get it wrong sometimes.
Okay, with that, I think we will move on. I'll thank the panel for a great discussion and move on. Good luck.
Thank you.
Tom.